So when did we stop killing and eating people's lunch? The Jews. It's true. It's absolutely true. And of course it spills over into Christianity and Islam. These are religions that ultimately are traced back to the principle of one God, monotheistic religions. And they teach goodness. Goodness. What's a goodness? A person is sick. Don't take his shoes. Heal him. A person is weak. Strengthen him. A person can't look after himself. Look after him. A person dies. Bury him. So in his mind, correctly, Jewish people make humanity weak. And it's a disease. It's a plague. And we're all over the place. All true. All true. The Jewish people have existed for 4,000 years. And over this time, humanity as a family has learned what it means to look after poor people and hungry people and cold people and dead people and children. And what we don't use this word anymore, the retarded. These are basic, the Avraham Avinu's teachings on the most elementary level that are not ours anymore. They belong to the whole world. And he identified who's the source of all this weakness, of all this softness. The Jew. I got to kill him. Why? I want to create a strong man, not a weak man. I want to create a maximally evolved human being, yeah? Stalin also hated the Jews, but why? Because they're political. Because they're agitators. You can't control them. You never know what they're going to say. You create a political order, I have a bunch of rules, and then one Jew gets up and says, I protest, this is unfair. Think about it. So you see what's happening here? Two of the greatest anti-Semites hated Jewish people for 180-degree opposite reasons. One sees the Jew as soft, and the other sees the Jew as an agitator, as a troublemaker, uncontrollable. Stalin said this. Just like Hitler said this. The problem with the Jew is that he's a troublemaker, he's a revolutionary. He's going to come out against me, and I need to be able to control my civilization. So I have to get rid of the intelligentsia, I have to get all the people likely to oppose me. Put these two together. No, you make sense out of a Jew. It doesn't make sense.
So the Jew's no good because he's weak, and the Jew is no good
because he's an agitator.
He's strong.
That's right.
He speaks up.
That's right. And when one of these two poles becomes too dominant, you have a sick Jew. When a Jew becomes a bleeding heart, I'm sorry for raising politics in the cold winter of Minnesota, it's an issue. And when a Jew becomes too principled and loses his softness,
God forbid.
Oh.
No. It was against a particular shita, which is common among Orthodox Jews. So that's but nothing against you. No.
I'm still good?
Yeah, you're still. I don't know about that, but you're still young.
You're all right. I don't care what the FBI says.
You see, I have a right to say to you that you're judging me, or you're potentially judging me. So now we have to decide if you're potentially good.
No.
Good. Okay. Let me continue.
It's a mission to borrow an hours. I don't do that.
Okay. Very good. I was making a joke, but that's also fine. Now, by the way, if you put this online, you got to edit all the garbage out. Right. Then you can't put it online. If you combine these two ideas together, you understand what a Yid is. And a Yid is really both of these things. This is really what the Jewish people are. It's very deep. It's very profound. And I'm going to say it again. You cannot explain it in a box. There's a component here. There's a component here. When you add it up, there's a component here which is bigger than reason. There's something here. There's something about it. The combination, these character traits, goes to something very deep. And in the language of the Bible, language of the Torah, right? This is one of the classic contradictions in the Chumash, where God is angry with the Jewish people. Why? Because they're stiff-necked. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, forgive the Jewish people. Why? Because they're stiff-necked. And as children, you learn this and say, the Beit Shalom. You know, when you're a little kid, you don't learn to question. Not you don't learn to question because you're afraid to question. You learn to question because you assume that if adults tell you something, it's got to be true. And I remember learning, I was in the fourth grade, I was a kid, I was 8. I was 8 years old in the fourth grade. Things were different back then. And Rabbi Engel was my teacher, and we came across on one page, I'm creative.
Rabbi Engel?
Yes.
Pesach. He's Pesach's Chavrusa.
Okay, Florida.
Yeah.
And then the next page, Mamash, a page later, Moshe Rabbeinu says, no, you have to forgive them, you have to embrace them. Why? The stiff neck. And it was such an obvious contradiction, but I must be missing something. And of course, what you're missing is that the conversation between Hashem and Moshe is really, it's not an argument. Hashem is explaining, if you will, you can't control a Jew. And Moshe Rabbeinu answers, you're right, you can't control a Jew, but you can't kill a Jew either. And the principle is the same. I'm creative, a man of a hard neck. I'm going to tell you a maisaleh, which I have prepared here on my piece of paper. It's a great Jewish story. In Crown Heights, when I was growing up, we had a rabbi, a Rav. His name was Rabbi Dvorkin, Zalman Shimon Dvorkin, Olav Shalom. Rabbi Dvorkin was a Russian Jew, learned in Lubavitch. He was a big Talmud Chacham, a very, very refined man. He was an incredibly refined man. If you met him, you saw that he was just very refined, very soft-spoken. Now, when he learned in yeshiva, you're talking approximately the turn of the last century, a decade later, the world was in total upheaval, right? Today, everybody wants to be politically correct. Nobody wants to upset anybody else. In those days, the whole world was screaming at each other. Everyone was right, nobody else was right. People beat each other up over ideas, literally. And of course, one of the great victims of ages of reason are anything that's traditional. Whatever's old is no good. Kill it. What do we do next? We'll figure it out, but first get rid of what's no good, the old. And a traditional Jew, a Yid who learns Torah and sits in a yeshiva, is a waste of a life. You have to be modern, you have to get educated, and so on. So the Lubavitch yeshiva had a problem. They were educating Bocharim, they would come home, even if their parents and their immediate family supported what they were doing, there were a lot of friends and neighbors who looked the same, that beards and payas, but they were part of the culture that was saying, we got to make a change, we're going to fix it. So they had rules. One of the rules in Lubavitch was that if you came to learn Lubavitch Yeshiva, you had to stay for a couple of years before they let you go home once. They had to feel like they had fortified you, they had strengthened you to deal with the scoffing, as it were, the insults and and so on. Anyway, the second rule was they would tell the Bocharim that when you go home and someone tells you off, somebody ridicules you for being a yeshiva bach and having a beard and payas and a long coat, as they say in Lubavitch, davon sagen dem pasuk, you have to tell them where to go. And I can't say this in the shul for the people who are underage. You have to tell them off in a very, very, very blunt and not refined way, okay? Appealing to the Stalin Jew as opposed to the Hitler Jew. Anyways, Zalman Shimon goes home and he meets an old friend, someone who's 2 years older than he was, who had gone off to university, become an academic, an intellectual, and so on and so forth. He has the beard, he has the face, he looks like an Orthodox Jew, but underneath, it's all rotten. It's all corroded. And they meet and they talk like old friends. How are you? Where are you? I'm learning in yeshiva. So after Zalman Shimon told him what he's doing, this man said, you know, this is a new generation, it's a new age, it's a modern world. There's opportunities for Jewish people that have never existed before. You're living in the past. And you think you're wasting your life. You have such a great mind. You're going to sit there with the Talmud, an archaic book that no one has any use for. It's all Baba Mises. We've all decided that none of this ever happened, and on and on and on and on. Anyways, Zalman Shimon heard him out and walked away. But he forgot that he's supposed to tell him off. It's like a block later, he remembered that the rule was that if somebody derided you for being a Chassidish Abacha, you have to tell him the pasuk. So he turns around and starts chasing that guy down the street. Moshe. So Moshe stops, expecting to hear, maybe Reb Zalman Shimon wants to hear more about the new and the modern, and he walks up, ich hab vergessen sagen, and he told him, basically, go to hell. And he walked away. I forgot to tell you, you understand? This is a part of the Am Creative, you know. There's an expression that I heard once from a very wise man. It says in the Mishnah, Pirkei Avos, that as ponim legehenim, boishis ponim leganed. As ponim, a chutzpahnik goes to Gehenim. Boishis ponim, a bashful, shy, reticent person goes to Gan Eden. So there's a gewaldige pshat. You want to live in the real world, you have to have chutzpah. As ponim legehenim, you want to be a Jew in a world which is to what Jewish people stand for. Hell, you have to be a chutzpahnik. Boishis ponim, you're a sheep, stay in the shtibel. Say in a protected environment. There's an element of, the Gemara says, Yisrael Azen Sheba Umis. There's a bit of a contradiction. The boldest, the most rude people are Jews. Then it says that Jewish people are bashful. So there's a discussion of how you fix those things. But there's a quality of chutzpah, which defines us. And it's a very significant component of why we survive, why we exist, why we thrive, and so on and so forth.
But that's natural. It's not, you don't have to work on it. I mean, I'm saying every Yid has that by nature, being a Yid.
Yeah, Alan Dershowitz wrote a book called Chutzpah,
Right.
trying to explain the Jewish gestalt.
But what is the reality? The reality is that being a human being is not easy, right? We don't come onto this earth with entitlements. Entitlement is a socially engineered idea. Life is tough. That's why Yebishter made the world. Life is tough. And it's supposed to be tough. It's supposed to be tough not just because it's cruel, but because it makes us. Right? The things in our lives that are the most valuable came to us the hardest. The things in our lives that came to us easy have little value, and they are of little value. That's just the way it is. Life is tough. So here you get, so to speak, the reality of the Jew. The Rebbe is a Yid. The Rebbe is a Yid. It's Yud Shvat. Today is actually Yud Shvat. Today we celebrate the Rebbe's ascent to the leadership of Lubavitch. And of course, all of us understand and appreciate that having the Rebbe as a Rebbe is not being a member of a fan club. It's very, very demanding. I mean, that's what a Rebbe does. A Rebbe gives instructions, especially a Chabad Rebbe, and we need to follow. He creates a full course and we need to walk. And it's not always so easy. But the Rebbe personifies what I shared. Both of these components. Incredible gentleness, incredible softness, incredible goodness, incredible tolerance, and incredible chutzpah. Incredible boldness, incredible, I really don't care what anybody thinks. And in the Rebbe, these two things are fused perfectly, because the Rebbe is very deeply in touch with himself, right? The Rebbe is a tzaddik. He's very deeply in touch with this fusion, which is part of the Jewish identity. There are so many stories of this. In one meeting, the Rebbe would go from being a gentle Zayde to being a general who could cut you in two with such determination. There was a Jew named Lezer Nanes. You may have heard the name. He passed away about close to 20 years ago, probably 1999. And he was 99 years old when he died. He spent 20 years in the gulags, 20 years. And him and his wife never had children. And I believe that part of the reason they never had children is because during the years that they were of child-rearing age, they were apart. Begashmias. And the Rebbe told him the years that he spent in the gulag don't count. Him and his wife both lived till 99 years. And when you live 20 years in the gulag, your life is shortened. It's not elongated, not lengthened. So Lezer Nanes tells a story. He wrote a biography many, many years ago, in the 70s. He wrote a biography under a pseudonym called Subota. He was called the Subotnik. In Siberia, they called him the Subotnik because he wouldn't work Shabbos. Subbote is Shabbos, Saturday. And the prisoners and the prison guards, the prison warden called him Subotnik because he was prepared to die, not to work on Shabbos. I mean, the stories that he tells are nuts. So he wrote a book under a pseudonym, Avram Netzach, in Yiddish. I remember reading it as a child, describing his 20 years in the Gulag. And of course, when the Soviet Union fell, that book was rewritten and was made more honest. And he also added more to his biography. His early years were added, and his later years were also added into a comprehensive biography of this man's life. It's available in Hebrew. It's a 2-volume set called Ha'ish Shaloi Nichna, the man who wouldn't bend. It's a remarkable story about an incredible Jew. It's in Hebrew. I don't know if it's translated into English, but it's a very good read. So I read the old Yiddish, and then when it was redone, I read it again with all the additions. I have a short little story. You may not think much of it, but I appreciate this story. He came out of Russia. He was about 67 years old. So he came out in 1966. He was born around the turn of the century, 65, 60 years old. Now, what do you think he thought his life expectancy was? He would live another 35 years. But he figured he's got 3 more years, 4 more years. The man spent 20 years suffering. Physical torture, psychological torture. It's exhausting. So him and his wife, they were childless, came from Russia. And they came to see the Rebbe, and there's a nice little anecdote, a little prelude to the story, that when he was a boy, a bacher, he visited the Rebbe's home, and the Rebbe's father said to him, I want to show you my son. And he opened up the door. The Rebbe was sitting and studying. The Rebbe didn't even look up. The Rebbe didn't know. He said, you looked at him? He said, you looked at him. And then when he closed the door, he said to Leizer Nanis, this will benefit you. This will benefit you. When he walked in the Rebbe the first time, some 40 years later, 40 years later, he told the Rebbe this story, and the Rebbe smiled and said, no? Has it served you well? And of course the answer was yes. He was alive. That's the end of the story. Anyway, he told the Rebbe he wants to live in New York. He said, I'm halfway out. I'm at 1 foot in a banana peel, the other foot in a grave. I want to spend my last years after all the suffering with the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said to him, he has to go live in Israel. That's Israel. The Rebbe put him to work. The Rebbe gave him all kinds of jobs. He did incredible work. He was makar of a lot of Yidden to Chassidus and to Lubavitch and to Yiddishkeit. And he also was involved. The Rebbe put him in charge of a lot of very important Chabad. The Rebbe trusted him. And the Rebbe empowered him. The Rebbe made him a leader. He just came from Russia. Lubavitch was already well established. And the Rebbe just took this stranger and put him right to the top. And said, he's the boss. Because the Rebbe trusted him. There's a man of principle and a man of goodness and not politics. So he told the Rebbe he wants to be by the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says you have to be in Israel. They went back and forth. Finally, the Rebbe says to him, in Yiddish, of course, a soldier goes where the general commands. A soldier doesn't choose his own post. Those are the words. No big deal, yeah? But Leizer Nanis has a commentary to those words. He writes, he knew the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, well. He learned on Lubavitch. He knew the Frierdiker Rebbe and knew the Rebbe. This is his quote. I never heard a Rebbe speak so forcefully since I heard the previous Rebbe Fabreng when he wasn't yet a Rebbe. The Rebbe didn't say those words. The Rebbe pounded those words into his heart. He said them with such a tkifus. You couldn't ignore those words. They were said with such force. In the Rebbe's personality, in the Rebbe's reality, you saw gentleness and kindness and principle and toughness and aggression. You know, by dollars, you almost never see that side of the Rebbe. By dollars, the Rebbe is very, very, very collected, almost soft and sweet. There are rare occasions where you'll see the lion come out, and it's intense. I saw an Israeli diplomat come to see the Rebbe, and the cat came out of that cage. It's scary to watch. The force, the power. And in the Rebbe, these characteristics are combined in a healthy balance. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
I just want to mention that it's available in English, isn't it? The Subata?
Perhaps, maybe. I don't know.
I have the English book.
Of the old version or the new version?
I don't know. It's new, as far as I know.
So, anyway, it's wonderful. You read the stories and you say, what do I have in common with such a human being? Other than we both walked on the same earth.
We saw in the Gem video when the Rebbe is with the Belzer Rebbe. And he says, "No, what's happening with your with your kids with the drugs?" And the Belzer responds to him and says,
Bei uns,
bei uns nicht.
Ba'ins, nicht ba'ins.
Yeah, right? And Rebbe, and then the lion comes out when I remember that. I mean, his whole personality changes like immediately.
Yeah, but there are tough. I've seen that film, but I've seen tougher moments also. You ask people who were in the Rebbe's room in private, and they will tell you that they saw a power that was frightening. The problem is we're not Lubavitcher Rebbe, we're a little in schnooks and schlubs. So what happens to us is that one half of our personality becomes dominant over the other half of our personality. In other words, the reality of a Jewish person becomes either he develops a softness which becomes a sin because it has no limit. In the name of goodness, in the name of kindness, in the name of Rachmanis, everything is allowed. Or he becomes such an agitator, such a troublemaker, that he doesn't leave anybody room. And this is really the challenge of life. The challenge of a Yid is to figure out how to incorporate into our personalities a healthy balance between the idea that a Yid is a Rachman, a Yid is compassionate, and a Yid is kind, and a Yid is forgiving, and a Yid is principled. And he stands for something. And if something is wrong, he gets up and he protests. And to figure out that balance takes a lifetime. We're all born little, and we're all born with a tendency. We're with a nature. Some of us have one nature. In other words, some of us are more inclined in one direction. Others of us are inclined in another direction. What's supposed to happen to us as human beings is that we have to fuse the side of ourselves which is principled and borderline angry with the side of ourselves that's sensitive and understanding and knows when to keep our mouths shut. What a virtue. Yeah? And this is a very difficult thing to do. In reality of life, it's a very difficult thing to do. So and this is really the point. Yeah? And I have some insights that I want to share with you. Years ago, I used to use this expression. I call it the Anne Frank syndrome. What is the Anne Frank syndrome? And I don't know if it's an Anne Frank syndrome because people don't say that she didn't even say what she presumably said, but for the purposes of marketing, I call it the Anne Frank syndrome. Anne Frank is sitting in a room on top of her father's business, living by night and being quiet by day so they shouldn't get caught by the Nazis. And of course, we all know the end of the story. And she keeps a journal. She's a 12-year-old, she's a 13-year-old, she's a 14-year-old. She keeps a diary. And whether she said it or she didn't say it, it's attributed to Anne Frank. She writes, I remember reading it, why do they hate us? She can't figure it out. Why do they hate us? It dominates her journal. She keeps, why do they hate us? What did we ever do to them? And there's the famous quote, some people say it was written by a movie writer, where Anne Frank says, I still believe that people are really good at heart.